Hello everyone, Stakuyi here, and today we are going to do a deep dive into the Ottoman harem. Now I know that my wife and I have covered this video topic before, but we haven't gone quite into much detail. We explained it, the surface of it at least, but on today's episode I want to do a deep dive that really examines the women of the Ottoman court and see what it is that they were like. Now when one imagines a harem, their thoughts may turn to opulent surroundings filled with beautiful sensuous women whose sole duty was to entertain an aging, yet simultaneously still lustful sheikh or sultan. This image may have been based on the imperial harems of the 16th and 17th centuries of the Ottoman Empire. In this period of history, harems played an important role in the governing of the Ottoman Empire, as the harem was not just a domestic entity, but also a political one as well. This most renowned period was known as the Reign of Women, or the Kadınlar Sultanati. The involvement of harem women in state politics diminished the power and position of the Sultan. As the Sultan was the head of the government, this interference proved to be detrimental to the Ottoman state. But really the question is, what is a harem? How did its power structure work? What did it look like? Let's examine this further. The Arabic word harem, when pronounced in Turkish, can mean wife, and was a symbol of both sacredness as well as privacy. The harem was defined as the women's quarter in a Muslim household, where the women of the family lived and outside men were forbidden. The Ottoman imperial harem itself was referred to as the Seraglio Harem, and this was inaccessible by foreign dignitaries as well as diplomats. This level of privacy and secrecy would be one of the contributing factors to the development of Western ideas of harems as places of a more lurid nature. But the core of the Ottoman harem, now that was political, and this was reflected in the lives as well as the compositions of its members. So now let us go ahead and look at the women that make up the harem itself. Starting at the base of the harem were something known as odalisques, also called odalisques in French. Typically these were virgin slaves that had been purchased at the market or were given by influential notables as gifts to the Sultan. Those that were bought typically came from war prisoners, kidnappings, or they were simply sold by impoverished parents. All slaves that entered the harem were termed odalisques, or women of the court, and were generally servants in the harem. Most of these odalisques were not seen as beautiful enough to be presented to the Sultan, and they remained servants, or karye. Those that were of extraordinary beauty and talent, well, they were seen as potential concubines and trained accordingly. These would learn to dance, recite poetry, play musical instruments, and master the erotic arts. Only the most gifted odalisques were presented to the Sultan as his personal maids, known as gedikli. Generally, odalisques would be assigned as servants to the oda, or court, of a harem mistress. For example, you have the mistress of robes, the keeper of baths, the keeper of jewels, etc. It was possible for these odalisques to rise to the ranks of kalfa, apprentice, and usta, master, in the harem hierarchy, and enjoy the security through their power and position. Odalisques that were seen as potential candidates for concubinage were trained to become talented entertainers. The greatest honor that a sultan could bestow upon a male guest was to present him with an odalisque from his court who had not yet become his concubine. These women were greatly coveted, as they were both beautiful as well as talented, and what is more important, they had links to the harem hierarchy. It is possible that concubines could be considered the equivalent to the modern version of a one-night stand, as there were odalisques that were presented to the Sultan, and then after that one night, they might never see the Sultan again. That is, of course, unless the girl became pregnant. The next step in the pyramid were concubines. An odalisque that had slept with the Sultan at least once, and mind you, could only sometimes be once, would be given the status of concubine, and the status that it entailed. This status would only change depending on whether or not said concubine would give birth to a child. For most odalisques, the status of concubine was the end of the line, and the furthest that they would ever get. Some would never sleep with the Sultan more than once, thus, if they never became pregnant, they would never rise further and become favorites. Concubines who were not favorites of the Sultan would become forgotten women of the harem. As some sultans had hundreds of concubines, this is something that could readily happen. On the other hand, a concubine that had caught the favor of the sultan and received more attention might be referred to as something called an iqbal, or favored. If an iqbal had truly captured the favor of the sultan and had given birth to a child, then it was possible to rise yet further. At the birth of a child, an iqbal would be raised to the title of haseki and be rewarded appropriately with her own quarters as well as her own attendants. Haseki in this case being akin to consort, meaning one that belongs to the sultan. If the child happened to be a son, she would join the ranks of the kadins. In English, kadin is most closely associated with legal wife, but this is not accurate when looking at the Ottoman harem tradition as a whole, and the reason for its existence. Ottoman tradition relied on slave concubines along with legal marriages for reproduction. Slave concubines served to emphasize the patriarchal nature of power, with power being hereditary through sons only. Slave concubines, unlike wives, they had no such recognized lineage. Wives were feared to have a vested interest in their own family's affairs, which would interfere with their loyalty to their husband. Hence, concubines were preferred if one could afford them. This led to the evolution of slave concubines as an equal form of reproduction that theoretically did not carry the risks of marriage, mainly that of the potential betrayal of a wife or the influence of her family in the state. Each kadin wished to move up in rank, but the ultimate aim was not to be the first kadin, or haseki sultana, but rather to be the next Valdez Sultana. After the 16th century, it was typically only the mother of the current sultan that was permitted to bear the title of sultana. This retention of title of sultan for the mother indicated the power of the Valdez Sultan. After all, men could take as many concubines and odalisques as they desired, but they only had one mother. This ambition would trigger intrigue, gossip, and even murder within the harem, as well as the government. To attain their goals, these ladies of the harem would also seek help from the princesses, married mostly to grand viziers or other high government officials. These men never went against their wives' wishes, knowing all too well how fatal harem gossip could be. The ultimate goal of an ambitious and capable Valdez Sultana was to rule the entire empire through a young, or at least malleable, son. This aim was achieved now and then, sometimes with devastating results. Which of course brings us to the top of the social and political ladder of the harem, that being the woman that was known as the Valdez Sultana. This was the mother of the current reigning sultan, and by virtue of this relation, the most powerful woman in the empire. The Valdez Sultan was responsible for the maintenance of order and peace within the harem, even controlling who the sultan would share relations with. No court lady could leave or enter the premises of the harem without the explicit permission of the Valdez Sultana. The power of the sultana over concubines even extended to questions of life and death, with eunuchs reporting directly to her. Being a female elder in the imperial harem, the Valdez was expected to serve as both a guide and a teacher to her son, by educating him about the intricacies of state politics. This training for both the Valdez as well as the sultan for their respective roles would begin at a younger age for both of them, as when the prince left the capital for his provincial governorate, he was accompanied by his mother. This was in order for her to complete her role of presiding over the prince's domestic household and performing her duty of training and supervision. Often, she would be asked to intervene upon the sultan's decisions when the mufti, the head of the Muslim religion, or the viziers, which were the ministers, felt that the sultan may have made a erroneous decision, one that they could not bring up directly to his face. At times, the Valdez would act as regent for her son, particularly in the 17th century, when a series of accidents necessitated regencies that endowed the position of Queen Mother with great political power. And with that, I hope you enjoyed today's deep dive into the Ottoman harem and its structure. This is something that has analyzed the role of women within the harem itself, but there are far more members that have not yet been considered, that being eunuchs. On the next episode, we will do a deep dive on eunuchs, both looking at their roles as well as duties within the harem itself. I appreciate you all for joining me here, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.